Still a couple more people joining. I also want to acknowledge that I'm calling from the traditional and unceded territory of the Lheidli. However, FSC's work spans across many, many traditional lands cared for by Indigenous peoples across Turtle Island since time immemorial. As someone whose ancestors were brought to this land without consent, I am constantly very honored and privileged to be able to work to determine what reconciliation means for me and for the lands that I continue to occupy. We at FSC are honored to be able to share knowledge, amplify diverse voices, and advocate alongside food systems allies from coast to coast to coast. So the objective of this webinar today is to discuss what's at stake on food during this election, which has been very focused on the US tariffs. We want to explore together how Canada could respond to the tariffs by laying the groundwork for food sovereignty and enable people to make informed voting choices. Okay, I am going to go ahead and introduce our panelists today. So we have Sophia Murphy, who is the Executive Director of the Institute for Agriculture and Trade Policy, the IATP. Sophia is a food systems and international economy expert with 30 years of professional experience, including as a board chair, program director, policy analyst, and published writer, a policy expert and advocate who has focused on resilient food systems, agriculture, and international trade. Sophia has worked primarily with civil society organizations as well as with government intergovernmental organizations and universities. Welcome, Sophia. Thank you for being here. Our next talented panelist is Pam Prosh. They are the coordinator of the Justice for Workers campaign and an organizer with the Workers Action Center. Previously, Pam served as the education director of the Ontario Federation of Labour and as the Ontario Campaigns and Government Relations coordinator with the Canadian Federation of Students. She is a longstanding social justice activist now based in Toronto. Hi, Pam. Thanks. Nice to see you again. And Phil Mount was born and raised on a dairy farm in Eastern Ontario. Phil is the National Farmer Union's Vice President of Policy. Phil has a research background in political economy and sustainable regional food systems, and along with Denise, is currently developing joint food and farm enterprises, expanding both a mixed Katahdin flock, you're going to have to help me with that one, at Flat Earth Farm, and a processing and food service enterprise at the Sheepdog Grill. Thanks for being here, Phil. How do I pronounce that? Katahdin?
Katahdin, yes.
Okay. So it's just like third time's the charm. Thank you all so much for being here. We're really, really excited to be able to have all of you here. I think it's going to be a really diverse and interesting discussion. And so we're going to jump right into it. And I'm going to start with a question for all of you. Oh, no, I'm not. Sorry, someone changed the script on me. It's fine. How about I'm going to ask Sophia to lay the groundwork for us. You have been working for decades on trade and food policy, both in Canada and the US. Can you try to make sense of the current political moment for us? What are you seeing from the Institute for Agriculture and Trade headquarters?
Thanks for that, Marissa, and thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm in Minneapolis, the ancestral and contemporary homeland of the Dakota and Anishinaabe peoples. So how to make sense of something? I think one of the things to say, and I'm sure you felt it in Canada just as strongly, is the sense of shock and affront at a lot of things that are going on. A lot of things that happened, that we maybe saw telegraphed, but have happened much more quickly and much more violently than we expected. I don't know that anyone saw quite the attack on Canada. But I will say, so one of the ways I try to make sense of it is to think about what is happening to science, more or less truth might be a way that we would talk about it more commonly in our community. What is being held up? What is being denied? What is being buried? And the role of science, the role of understanding, the role of evidence, which I think has been so important to us as civil society organizations, and the way that has been attacked. And then a second broad attack on the rule of law. So even before you get to tariffs and trade and what we think about what should be happening, the a trade agreement depends upon a structure of law, a structure of institutions and how they work. And those institutions have been attacked on multiple fronts: the role of government civil servants, the role of the president in relation to the legislature, you know, quite differently from Canada. The executive, presided over by the president, has a separate kind of line of authority. They're not chosen by Congress. They don't report back to Congress, but they have distinct roles in the Constitution. And President Trump has violated a number of those constitutional differences, and he's testing that out, it seems, in the court of law. And the law is a little bit all over the place in responding and slow. But that basic idea that an agreement stands as law has been profoundly challenged. And then the third big section is on sort of rights, people's rights, human rights. So the detention of people at the border, the removal of people to El Salvador, to prisons, this kind of behavior obviously is violating human rights. And one of the problems of dealing with the context is, what do you respond to? How do you respond? And it's all happening at the same time. And I think you're starting to see different strands emerge finally. So in all of that, the tariffs are a very kind of specific instance of all of the above. They don't make sense. I don't think there's a single economist who's tried to defend the policy. In fact, there are cabinet members, they make different explanations. Those explanations are not coherent one to the other, and they don't actually, they're wrong. They're based on a sort of factually incorrect understanding of what a tariff may or may not do or how it might work. A second part that's very important is the uncertainty. Tariffs are on, tariffs are off, tariffs might be back, tariffs are 10%, tariffs are 20%, tariffs are 100%. These are very different things. A tariff is a tax that basically the importer has to pay. And a tariff of 2 or 5 or even 10% is something that you might consider factoring into an expense. A tariff of 50 or 100, by then you may as well make it 1,000. It's no longer going to be something that's brought in. So these tariffs are not all alike, and 5% is not like a Richter scale, you know, where the shock, or maybe like a Richter scale, the shock is exponential. So the bigger the tariff, it's sort of not linear, but exponentially more dramatic in what you might see happen. And then I don't know in terms of rights exactly, but these tariffs, the way they calculated them, which I could explain, it's not a way anybody would ever think about. It's nothing to do with reciprocity. It's more or less based on an idea that no country should be selling more to the United States than they are buying from the United States. And so the poorest countries with the largest sort of export markets to the US that can't afford to buy from the US and whose purchasing power would make no difference to an economy as big as the US economy is, they have the biggest tariffs. So the most absurd possible outcome. One little side note, the golf shirts that are sold in the Trump golf courses around the world are made in these factories in Lesotho, that if one of the countries that is facing, I forget the final rate, but it would have been close to 90%. And then I think they halved it, and that's now on pause. But, you know, this sort of absurdity is that it's hitting the most vulnerable the hardest for no reason, except that there's some convoluted logic in the planning. So that's a lot of different kinds of thoughts, but I'll start there.
Yeah, thank you. And like you said, there's just so much happening, and it almost strikes me as sort of the, you know, like a magician who's like, look over here while I'm doing a bunch of things over here. And is the sort of widespread chaos that is being caused strategic? Are you thinking, Sophia, that it is on purpose to confuse us all and we're not really sure where to go and who to stand up for and where to protest?
I think there is definitely an interest in making it hard to respond by attacking many places all at once. On the other hand, you've attacked everybody. They've attacked veterans. They've attacked, you know, all of the civil service at the same time, including departments that would implement the new regulations that they have. So I think we shouldn't underestimate the incompetence either. It's evident. Now, there's also personal profit potential. So if you watch who's making money on the stock market with insider knowledge on where tariffs are going next, it's clearly benefiting personally. So opportunities for personal gain are there. And I do think there are some ideas around this broad idea, for example, that it's a bad thing to have import more than you export, or I think there are some who think they should be renationalizing some parts of production, but I don't think there's a coherent strategy around that. And I think even the sort of shock and awe is not consistently shared. And so you see it with this brinksmanship with the market. There's a lot of very real concern about not just is the US on track probably now for recession, which is going to cause a lot of economic misery within the country, but being so big and being such an important global player, it's threatening all these other countries at the same time, and a lot of wealthy people who have more access to Mar-a-Lago, where the president now sits. So I don't think that there's a strategy around that, and I think that it may be that they will come to regret having done that. But it's true that it's very disempowering to not know exactly where and how, which fight to fight first.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I also appreciate the quote. We can't underestimate the incompetence, because it is very accurate. Pam, with your role advocating for workers, how are you thinking about the current political moment? What opportunities and what risks are you seeing right now?
Yes, and that's an excellent question. And Sophia, thank you for laying that out, because so much of the public policy discourse right now about how to, quote, deal with the tariff crisis is really about focusing on like a kind of, a corporate response, if you will. And workers almost everywhere around the world are an afterthought, if they're even included at all. And in some ways, this is just a continuation of how the, world economic order operates. But I feel as though it's quite acute at this point in time. And no matter where we are, it's worrisome that, the kind of rise of nationalism, in my view anyway, and full disclosure, we're trying to build a network of solidarity for workers here and around the world. And we think that most of the world's problems can't be solved one country at a time. So whether it's climate change or peace or justice or anything, really, it's going to take a global vision. So we're worried about how the responses have come into play. And it's interesting to me because in the past, whenever we have campaigned for a higher minimum wage or better working conditions for workers, the rationale that the 1% gives for not wanting to move on that is that, oh, we can't do that. That's going to hurt corporations, and that's going to reduce profit, and that's going to cause companies to flee the country. And so we've had to kind of go at this like myth by myth by myth, because one thing that we have learned in this process of advocating for better wages and working conditions for workers is that when you raise the floor of wages and working conditions, actually it has an amazing cascading effect through the whole economy. So what that means is that more workers can participate in the economy. Workers are healthier. Workers can participate in civic life when wages are better. And contrary to this notion that raising wages is going to trigger inflation, actually the evidence doesn't show that at all. If anything, what we see is that raising the floor of wages has the effect of compressing profit. And what we've seen over the years is that when you get an erosion of workers' wages and working conditions, you see a growing gap between the top and the bottom of the world. And that's why we have inequality at acute levels, not just in Canada and the US, but actually all around the world. And so for us, we're trying to think through what are the policy needs that workers have right now to cope with the restructuring of the global economy. Because as Sophia was saying, the uncertainty, whether the tariffs are on or off, the uncertainty that this has created really has long-term implications in terms of how people conduct trade, how they plan their businesses, et cetera, et cetera. And so changing, I mean, honestly, 40 years of neoliberalism and globalization and, structured policy, demands from the World Bank and so forth on developing nations and so forth, the global South, have resulted in a trade regime that we had up until 4 months ago. And suddenly that has been more or less blown up. And so, we may all agree that it's not ideal to ship a part for a car 10 times around the world before it's finally assembled in a car. But in order to kind of restructure in that way, it's going to take years and literally millions, billions of dollars of investment to recreate the companies that can actually produce the things that people need at home. And so while it might be a longer term goal, and while many of us who were opposing free trade deals many, many years ago, at some level have been proven right, in some ways the solution now is still going to be harmful for workers. So one of the things we're trying to do is center workers in the conversation about responding to tariffs. So we're demanding adequate income support, and either through employment insurance, where workers and employers pay into. In Canada, it's a form of deferred wages. So workers kick in a bit, employers kick in a bit, and it's wages that are there for us in a crisis. Similarly, with Canada Pension Plan and things like this. But we have a big, employment insurance is supposed to be a big safety net for employers and for workers to stabilize the economy. But that safety net is so full of holes because many workers are not actually protected by employment. They're misclassified by their employer, or they are part-time workers, or there's unfair rules, or they're migrant workers or farm workers who are excluded altogether from employment standards. And these are the kinds of things that we're really trying to campaign on. So in the first instance, income security, which is we're demanding $600 a week, either through employment insurance or through direct grants or through whatever social assistance programs, disability support programs, old age security programs, workers' compensation programs, whatever that is. We learned during COVID, at least in Canada, that workers need at least $500 a week. That was half a decade ago and before double-digit inflation. So the least we can do is $600 a week. But we also think there's other steps governments can take. And we think the governments can easily take a page from World War II and freeze the price of food at the grocery stores to stop that grocery store chain gouging. But also making sure that the people who are growing the food are getting a fair deal as well. We think the government at all levels can step in and implement real rent control for everybody. But in this crisis period, which is going to be much more prolonged as the economy restructures, we need to have a moratorium on evictions. And one really great way of cutting against the unemployment that is very likely to ensue because of tariffs is to actually invest in social services and social infrastructure. And we know in Canada, our experience has been that actually social programs are not some horrible burden on people and where the money we kick in goes into some black hole of bureaucracy. Actually, the money we contribute in taxes funds our healthcare program, which would be very expensive otherwise, as people from the US know very well. Education, while post-secondary costs are going up, still we have a public education system from kindergarten to grade 12 and some access to post-secondary education that is better. Even public transit, we can imagine how that could actually be a food and climate security issue if we were to start to dream about putting unemployed auto workers to work making transit cars, buses and streetcars and trams and all of that, and making public transit affordable and free and much more extensive across the country. So we can start to see social services as both a way of offering stability in an unstable circumstance, because when the government commits to building infrastructure and to support public services, it has the effect of creating good jobs, it has the effect of reducing costs for ordinary people, and it has the effect of stabilizing the economy. But right now, in the context of the election, we have a lot of politicians that are campaigning to cut taxes, to cut bureaucracy and so forth. And that revenue that comes in really is the lifeblood of our social programs. When people say, I love Canada, it's mostly they love Canada because we have healthcare, and mostly people love Canada because we have, some social programs that many people don't around the country. And it's the things that we fought for together that makes Canada great. And what we're hoping for is that if we can provide a bit of a blueprint for how can we fight to center workers and center communities as essential in stabilizing the economy, This could be a blueprint for workers all around the world, including in the United States, where they are absolutely getting left out of the equation altogether. And the last thing I'll just say is that when you stabilize workers in communities, you actually do stabilize the economy, because what corporations and employers, big and small, need more than anything are customers. And if workers have either no wages or low wages, they can't participate in the economy, and no amount of corporate tax cuts is going to incentivize an employer to create more stuff if they don't think they can sell the stuff they're already producing. And we're experiencing this in Ontario, where there was a mass layoff of auto workers that were producing electric cargo vans. And because they have too many vans and not enough buyers, they're shutting down production. And this is the irony of this crisis that we're all facing, is that we may be facing a crisis that is going to impoverish workers all around the world. And it won't be for lack of things. It will be for lack of resources to buy the things. And we're going to have too much stuff that can't be sold. And that is going to be the conditions in which people fall deeper into poverty. And to my mind, that is an absolute scandal. So I'll leave it at that. And thank you so much for the questions.
Thanks, Pam. It's really helpful. And as we suspected, so rich, so much to talk about here. And I think we're gonna leave with so many more questions. And this is indicative of how important it is to bring these conversations together. Phil, similar question. As the VP of Policy at the National Farmers Union, how are you thinking about the current political movement and moment, and what opportunities and risks are you seeing on your end?
Yeah, I'm actually going to build off of a lot of what Pam said. There's a lot of overlap actually between all three of our thoughts and our approaches to this current moment. I want to talk about two of the opportunities that I see that sort of resonate with what Pam had just said there, because I think what you can hear right now in this moment is people taking a step back and reevaluating our approach, how we got here, asking if we took a wrong turn, and agreeing we have to put some thought into how we might fix it, right? And that's a huge opportunity, because it challenges the accepted wisdom that's guided our political leaders, our budgets for 2 generations now. And these opportunities just don't come along that often. The risk is that there are lots of folks who are heavily invested into this system, and it makes the quickest solution, the one that makes this problem go away, seem like the best one. So what can we do to make the tariff thing go away now? Renegotiate the Canada-US-Mexico trade deal now. I think those are bad ideas, right? Those are bad sort of responses, but that's what we're hearing. Increase the already large amount of money that we spend on export market development in order to diversify our export markets. Well, that may be a decent idea when it comes to how do we solve the trade problem that's been created. But over the last 40 years, we've invested billions of dollars into developing and supporting export markets. And in the process, we've developed an unhealthy dependence on a single trading partner who, it turns out, has mental health issues. So now, in order to diversify our export markets, we need to spend even more money to build the infrastructure that will be needed to support those new export markets. This just proves the old adage, if I could paraphrase Jerry and the Sons of Rhythm Orchestra, the old adage, there's no such thing as free markets. This is directly connected to the second opportunity I see that we've all heard in the current political moment, right? This is one of those buy Canadian, buy local moments. And it's our second one in 5 years, right? We had one of those moments during the pandemic. The opportunity that I see now is that we get to explain why the response, just go and buy local food, is inadequate, right? We get to explain that this is why policy matters. We can't just vote with our dollars and expect to get food sovereignty by asking people to buy Canadian when shopping for groceries at your neighborhood oligopoly store, right? Or even just go buy local at the farmer's market, although that option at least puts your food dollars right into the hands of your local farmer. The opportunity is that we demonstrate the need for all levels of government, that is, all of us as a society, to make a collective decision to put public dollars into infrastructure needed for domestic market-oriented production, processing, distribution, right? We need to support existing institutions. We need to build new ones so that food sovereignty and resilience gets baked into our food system. And we all know you can't bake if you have no ovens in your schools, in your hospitals, in your long-term care facilities, just for example, right? So we haven't got to where we are now with the food system we have now in this country without investing billions of dollars over the last 80 years. So, as I've said for the last 40 years, that investment and support has had this sort of tunnel vision focus on one type of market. We need to be diversifying all of our markets, not just our export markets, include into that our domestic markets, including funds and infrastructure for regional processing, storage, distribution, everything from abattoirs to food hubs to shipping stations. This isn't just to support a more like resilient food system for the next emergency, but it provides more and better options that directly support, for example, we have a new national school food program. They're being planned in every province, and it's going to provide what? Food processed in the US from a transnational food service company from the UK, right? That's the options we have right now. So I guess I'd say in that opportunity, the risk is that just as our like elected and unelected civil service chooses to spend generational sums of money investing in infrastructure needed to support a not yet existing diversified export market, they'll decide that a photo op at a farmer's market is adequate support for diversified domestic food markets. That's the risk that I see right now.
Thank you, Phil. And I think that sort of leads into our next question for all of the panelists around why is food sovereignty important now? And you're kind of touching on these pieces, and what policies can be put in place to build this infrastructure that we are talking about? What policies can be put in place to ensure that we're moving in the direction we want to be? And I'll just open it up to whoever wants to answer.
I'll jump in for a moment. I'll say, well, because we had such a clear illustration, and there's some comment pieces on our website about it, that at the same time as the US government announced all these tariffs and ostensibly created some opportunity for local food markets, they cut all of the spending that had been going into regional and local food support that we had been working on for maybe 15, 20 years and had gradually been building up from certain states into a national program to say part of the post-COVID, sort of build back better was to invest in regional systems, to turn the farm to school and farm to childcare programs into a local development mechanism, if you like, economics writ large, with all the things Phil is talking about in terms of distribution and processing centers for local food. So you cut that off at the same time as you theoretically, are creating this opportunity. So I think that there's maybe a short, medium, long-term kind of strategic thinking that is also needed. We are about to put a lot of people into unemployment. We are about to put a lot of people into a very much more expensive environment without any protection. And presumably in the US, those protections are far weaker even in the US. And so what are we doing immediately in terms of solidarity? And then how do we build through to say, we don't want what was there before, but we also don't want this kind of change, which is a kind of pillage of the sort of dying embers, if you like, of that neoliberal economy. And then just maybe shifting slightly towards food sovereignty, I will say to us, though, I think it is important in understanding this moment that we do need to pay attention to international relationships. And while we did not like the trade agreements, we are beholden and dependent on one another for this planet to survive. And so while we do need to reinforce and understand our food sovereignty building out from local systems, we also talk at IATP also about how those are nested in other bigger relationships. And I think there are models in fair trade, there are models in different You know, we want our food to be from somewhere, but somewhere doesn't have to be defined geographically as within 100 miles, in my opinion. And our relationships on how we get our food within 100 miles anyway has to pay attention to what damage it causes and what possibilities it throws up for people who are elsewhere. So I think it's an opportunity to be understanding food sovereignty as an interdependent relationship, in which, as in all relationships, you need autonomy, you need dignity, and then you need to engage and understand what the mutual benefit will be. And of course, what we have modeled from the United States right now is the opposite of that on all counts. And in some of the reaction we've seen is not going to move us further forward. And so how could we model a different way of understanding our interrelationship? And, you know, I have to admit, if I think about just dismantling all of our continental integration that started with the US-Canada agreement in '88 and went through to NAFTA, now, 40 years later, it won't be a simple ripping up of that agreement. And, you know, we have economic and other kinds of relationships that we need to think through. And we have a different understanding of our ecological vulnerability and responsibility too. And we have Indigenous peoples reminding us that the borders are arbitrary. So, not to make it vastly complicated, but maybe to kind of go back to some principles and see from there what we can build. And wanting to make an argument that sovereignty has more than one level of governance that is important.
I like that. I really appreciate that a lot, because I do think there is sort of this understanding of sovereignty as being sort of insular, and it's not, it's interdependent. Pam, Phil, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, sure. I couldn't agree more, Sophia. You know, our conception of food sovereignty certainly isn't insular or even, you know, the inverse sort of tunnel vision focus on a local and regional, if you will. But it certainly allows for much more, many more alternatives, options, just ways of building a more complete understanding of how we do trade and interact than the sort of very limited conceptions of what trade is that have been established, you know, over the last 40 years, for example. And I think, yeah, when we come to talk about some of the other pieces of what NFU has identified as sort of a food sovereignty approach, we can see that definitely there are mechanisms that you can use that will help to build food sovereignty that has you thinking more about how we can create a stable market within, and the simplest way of doing that, well, so simple perhaps isn't the right word, but one of the ways you can do that is to create sort of regional systems. But at the same time, we always have to think about all of the other pieces of our food system that aren't going to be contained within that. And that's where, you know, conceptualizations like just food, which is an idea of, you know, a new idea of relationships that we can create across borders that La Via Campesina is developing right now, is going to resonate, I think, because it's definitely a counterpoint that we need to the narrative that was created as a fiction of free trade. Just as there's no such thing as a free market, there's no such thing as free trade.
Well, maybe I'll just jump in a little bit on that as well, and to say maybe one of the things that we need to be thinking about is fair trade. And I know that's an old slogan, but we can dust it off a little bit. Fair trade, and maybe we can be thinking about food solidarity, and thinking and helping us to think through new ways of that, you know, building more connections with Indigenous communities to build solidarity across borders. Because I feel like my own self, I feel more and more and more that the vast majority of people on the world want a peaceful, sustainable, secure planet. And that is getting harder and harder and harder to, you know, deliver, because we have billionaires, and I'm so glad you mentioned, Phil, about buying Canadian, because honestly, Galen Weston is rich enough and he sings from the same songbook that the Americans billionaires do, that the Chinese billionaires do, the Mexican billionaires. And it's like, so how can workers learn to sing better from the same songbook? But I did want to pick up a little bit on a really interesting insight around this desperation to, quote, make the tariffs go away. And so maybe this is about how not to deliver food security rather than how to. But I wanted to pick up on that point because I'm also very worried that what is being offered up is that we are going to increase our military spending, we're going to increase our border security, and all of that is about, whipping up xenophobia, trying to break and undermine solidarity among communities, both inside, our own borders, but outside our own borders. And I also worry about the military in general as something that could very well drain funds from our public infrastructure that's so essential, and also how the military can really weaponize access to food. And I think there's lots of examples around the world where access to food is weaponized to serve a particular political agenda. So I want us to, I know the federal election is just a few days away, but those are the kinds of things I think we need to be thinking about for after the election, because there is really going to be a push, I think, to divert money away from the people, the structures and services and people who need it, right into military spending. And not to scare anybody, but I'm acutely aware that while not every trade war is followed by a hot war, every hot war is preceded by a trade war. And I worry about how dangerous the world is becoming. But I feel like, a long time ago, I'm old enough to remember the first Iraq war. And there was this moment when there's, some of the biggest demonstrations happened all around the world for peace. And I remember, I think it was Time magazine talked about the other this was in the days when there were two superpowers, the US and I forget whether it was China or the Soviet Union or whatever, but they said the other superpower, and that was global solidarity is the other superpower. And to be thinking through how can we start to rebuild and reforge that other superpower of global solidarity.
Thank you. Wow, really, really inspiring. I appreciate that. Keeping an eye on time, I think we have a little bit more time before we open it up. So, Sophia, if you were advising the next Prime Minister of Canada, what would a key message or strategy be? What would be a smart, nuanced, phased way to use the tariffs to protect local markets first and foremost for local producers? Can tariffs be used to protect food sovereignty? Acknowledging that we are talking not just about local in, as you mentioned, 100. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I think some of those points have been touched upon. So one is, if you want to build something, you're going to have to invest in it. And the tariff is not an investment. And I think Phil has made that point, and we've come around. And I really would come back just to reiterate that food sovereignty starts with strong local and regional food systems. And then I build out from there, if there's a sort of hierarchy of it. And two, I would say that regardless of the madness holding sway in the US, the climate change, biodiversity loss, environmental challenges that face us are not going away, and they are very real limits on the model we've had and that Pam has been describing of an economy that is profoundly extractive of workers, but also of our resources, and profoundly wasteful. And so, selling what we were selling to the US, not speaking with my Canadian hat on, selling what Canada was selling to the US and instead selling it to China is not dealing with the crisis that Canada was anyway looking at, which was massive amounts of food production, or I wouldn't say food, but ag commodity production going overseas at the expense of land and water and other, worker kind of conditions that were not acceptable, and leaving people still food insecure. So I think that, not being distracted by the tariffs, to understand that you still need to figure out and change your vision. And then I would be coming back again to points that Pam made at the beginning about the safety nets. And Pam was talking about unemployment insurance. From where I sit, I would be talking about health insurance, which, as we know in Canada, could be better, even though it's there. This sort of safety net that we need in order for people to be able to work on and invest in their economies, whether it's in the agricultural economy or otherwise, in ways that are more responsible, less destroying of the base, better for the future generations. All of that challenge remains, and in a way, the tariffs, of course, this is the opportunity. We're saying it's not secure as it was, but we still have to be saying it is not sustainable as it is. It is deeply unequal, and that does generate violence and potential for conflict, as Pam pointed to. It continues us on a path that deprives our children and our grandchildren of what they should expect to see. So that would be a lot to put into an advisory to the Prime Minister, but I'll leave it there for now.
Good. Well, there's a lot to be said. They should be ready to listen. Thanks, Sophia. Pam, I know you have commented and mentioned sort of the impact on labor with the decisions that are being made, but I just wanted to open it up for if you wanted to expand on that further or speak to anything really about how labor is really being impacted right now.
Yeah, thank you. In some ways, that I really do feel like it's the missing topic of conversation. And even when politicians do talk about how they're going to be supporting workers, it really is through this notion that first we support corporations, and then it's going to trickle down to workers and communities. And honestly, it just doesn't objectively work like that. And I feel like it's plain as day, where we really have seen unprecedented wealth consolidation amongst a few people. So I guess that's the first thing. But I also did want to say that to pick up on a point that Sophia was talking about is that the social investments that are required, because it's not just about income, because let's say we all get $600 a week in income, but if we have to hand it over to a private landlord, then it doesn't matter how much money we make if the private landlords are just going to take the money and put it in their pockets. And the same thing, there's a real danger that, let's say the government issued us all a check for $50,000 a year, but then we had to go buy our healthcare on the market. We had to go buy our housing on the market. We had to go buy, our childcare or our education or whatever it is. You can see how quickly the government support of income is just going to be another funnel into private profits. And so one of the things that we're trying to get at around investment in public services and public infrastructure, especially around the question of housing, is really important, because right now there is an acute housing crisis. And governments are responding by blaming immigrants or blaming international students. And this is a means of justifying more military, more policing, more border control. It's not really about addressing the housing crisis. But some of us know that in our guts, but we haven't had a chance to unpack how it could be different. And I wanted to just share a little epiphany that I had that turns out to be true, is that there was an alarmist headline in the Toronto Star a few weeks ago. It's like, population growth hasn't been this high since the 1950s. And everything bad that's happening is a result of population growth. But that made me think, gee, that means population growth must have been higher at some point in the 1950s. And that made me think about, was there a housing crisis back in the 1950s? And then I went back and started to dig, and actually, to be sure, inequality is always a problem under our current economic system. But if you actually look at what was happening in the post-World War II period, governments were investing. They wanted veterans who served in the war to come back and have a home. Newcomers were being encouraged to come, and they wanted housing to be affordable. And as a result, there was really unprecedented investment in multiple forms of non-market housing that reached its high point in the 1970s. But then since then, it's been cut. And even the stock of high quality social housing that we used to have has been allowed to fall into a state of disrepair. Meanwhile, rent control laws have been weakened, and we basically are saying, we're going to solve the housing crisis by handing over public land to private developers. And then we're astonished when they're not delivering deeply affordable housing. And the reason actually the CEO of the developer lobby group, it's called RealPAC, said point blank that we are a business, we can't be tasked with providing deeply affordable housing. That's not our job. And so when somebody shows you who they are, we should believe them. But that's an argument for state intervention to provide the housing, which could provide the jobs, it could put the construction workers back to work, which could actually have high environmental standards that, that addresses climate issues and so forth. So I guess I just wanted to say, wherever we can make a breakthrough on some of these issues around public funding, the role of taxes, but it has to be said, corporations need to pay their fair share because that's the biggest problem. In the 1950s, revenue was about 50-50 from corporations and from individuals. And today the gap is just massive. It's something like 60+% comes from individuals and about 20% comes from corporations. So of course we can't afford to do anything. So let's Pierre Poilievre, our version of Trump here in Canada, if I can be frank with this audience, is basically saying axe the tax. Well, he wants to cut resources for public funding. And we need to say, actually, I know it's an old slogan, but tax the rich and tax the corporations, because as long as there's even one billionaire in Canada, that's a tax policy failure, in my humble opinion.
Thanks, Pam. I appreciate that. And I really appreciate your emphasis on the intersectionality of this issue, right? We cannot look at it in our silos as we have been doing, the same way we cannot look at it just as one country. We have to be intersectionally looking at all of these things because they cannot be, they're intertwined and we can't untwine them. Phil, question around what is NFU advocating for right now? We had a piece around what sort of is supply management and what is its role in protecting Canada's food system in these trade agreements. So if you want to expand on that, feel free. Or if you want to jump off of anything else that has been said, please feel free to do that, because I know we have been sort of touching on a lot of things all over here.
We sure have. And I just wanted to touch quickly on excellent points made by both Sophia and Pam. But Pam, you triggered something in my mind here that I didn't want to lose sight of. We've seen this time and again, particularly after the 2008 recession, or whatever you want to call it, moment. My biggest concern right now is we're in another moment, and what happens, in these moments of fragility in the financial system is they start looking for places to park their cash. And we see that not only in the urban market, we're seeing it increasingly in the agricultural market as well, land all over the world, but even in Canada here, people, investors in particular, find it a great place to park their cash when they're worried. And it just makes the entire agricultural system unbalanced. Like, we no longer in this country, in practically any province of Canada now, have a relationship between sort of the cost of production, of producing food, and the value of the land anymore. Like, it's just completely out of whack now. So good luck to new and young farmers looking for land. In the same way, good luck to new and young families or young folks who are just entering the job market, ever expecting to purchase a house, in the urban climate that we have now. So I just wanted to make that sort of connection too, because there is spillover into what we're seeing in agriculture. And I guess, Marissa, I mean, my take on the supply management, I mean, we've been long supporters of supply management in this country. And I mean, in my mind, I grew up on a supply management farm, on a dairy farm. And quite frankly, that farm wouldn't have lasted at all in the free market system that they have in the US for, more than 20 years. What the supply management system does, it's almost a perfect sort of a microcosm of what food sovereignty does, really, because it's an agreement basically between the farmers that they're going to produce a certain amount, no more, no less, and in exchange for that, they're not going to get screwed over in the system, quite frankly, and it's sort of that balance of farmer power on the one side against the very sort of concentrated power of the processors, which is what, and the transporters, which is what was happening in the 50s and 60s in Canada, who had just an incredible amount of power, especially when you consider that, I mean, the things that we protect with supply management in Canada, milk, eggs, raw meat, chicken, turkey, like all of those very perishable products. And for the most part, it can't be turned on and off or put up on a shelf for a couple of months until the market heats up again so you can sell it. You can't tell a cow to turn off her milk. So um, the people with sort of outsized power in that system had farmers over a barrel and recognized it. And so the farmers recognized the only way they could compete with that was to get together and to raise hell. And so, they basically got an agreement in this country that we were going to establish a very fair system that would provide not a shocking amount and an ever growing amount of revenue, to the unending growth model of economy. No, just a stable, livable income based on how much it costs us to actually produce this food. What a concept, And then, of course, which has to be said in a country like Canada, where we have 1/10 of the population of this beast that lives beside us, right? You have to put up a wall, which is kind of amusing, given the rhetoric of the country below us. But like a wall to keep out this tidal wave of food that would just wash over the border, not even, as an extra effort on the part of American producers. It would just be a trickle of spillage over the edge of the bathtub, and it would wipe out Canadian production, really, honestly. So it had to be done. We needed some kind of tariff barrier at the border holding back this wall of food, because there is no way our producers could compete in a market that continually gets flooded by basically excess production from the United States. So those are the three key pieces, right? Like, we agreed that we were going to regulate what we produced, we were going to get a fair price for it, and we had to put up some kind of protection so that that market didn't get flooded constantly. It's a perfect sort of microcosm of what food sovereignty is, giving power to producers and consumers, right? Consumers have a role in setting what that cost of production should look like, and it reflects the prices that they pay in the grocery store. That said, supply management does not regulate what grocery retailers charge for those things once they get to the grocery store. It's out of the hands of that model by then. So as we saw it in the pandemic, sometimes those things can get a little wonky, but it's about as good a job as we can do. And if you look at, supply management farmers versus other farmers, they have had a much more stable production system over the last 50 years than just about anyone else. It's a great model, and it's not exposed to tariff threats because we don't really intentionally produce a lot to export from these. That's not the point of it. We're feeding people here.
Wow. Thank you so much. That was very, very helpful. I don't think I had a strong understanding of that, and that really helped clarify that for me. I appreciate that. So we're going to open it up. We're going to open it up for questions from our audience. So there's a couple ways that you can do that, folks. We've been gathering the questions we've seen in the chat, but if you would like to continue to put your questions in the chat, we will continue to grab them. Or if you want to raise your Zoom hand, we will call on you to ask our panelists something. I have a question already.
Excuse me, when that person is done, because I can't do it the same way because I'm just over the phone, could I ask several questions?
Yeah, absolutely. So
Because I do
sorry,
have
who's speaking?
I'm really upset with. It's Elizabeth. There's some stuff that has been said that I'm extremely upset with.
Okay, so I'm gonna go ahead and okay,
Yeah,
I'm
you go
gonna
ahead
ask.
and ask, but I would like to be able to ask my questions as well.
Sure. So the question in the chat here is, can you folks touch on potential collaborations with cooperative and union movements in Canada?
Marissa, could you repeat that, please?
I sure can. Can you touch on potential collaborations with cooperative and union movements in Canada?
Is it okay if I take a stab at that?
Please do.
Well, that's a great question. Thank you. And one of the things that we're trying to do in our movement that we call Justice for Workers is to try to make links between union and non-union workers who lots of times people think all union members are kind of fat cats, and sometimes union members think workers without unions are hapless victims. And so what we try to do is bring people together so that people get a sense that, you know, we're all fighting for the same things, we're all fighting for common cause, and to try to stop that tendency to pit people against each other. And I think there's been more and more efforts around thinking through cooperative ventures, whether it's cooperative gardening, whether it's cooperative housing, and to maybe work together to put some of these things back onto the political agenda so that there's multiple ways that we're investing in kind of non-market solutions for people. And, you know, not to keep coming back around housing, but imagine if we actually had government support at all levels, not just for building high quality social housing, but also to be supporting people who are taking efforts at cooperative housing, cooperative gardens, farming, things like that. I don't necessarily have a blueprint, but I do think the more these conversations can be had, the better we'll be. And last thing I'll just mention is that in Chicago, the Chicago teachers unions have been making a really special effort to make links with communities. And when they go into collective bargaining, they've called it bargaining for the common good. And so they have been trying to make connections with communities that are under-resourced to be thinking through what are the demands that they need for the union movement to take on, and you know, and whether it's, you know, using the schoolyards for growing and food production, whether it's clean air, good jobs, a more of an intentional effort. Because I'll just say, I think in the past, and maybe it exists today, that this notion that, you know, if you can just do good for a group of people, that by itself is going to create more space for other people to, you know, achieve the same things. And I don't think it's as straightforward as that. I think that unless we are intentionally linking our struggles and intentionally trying to actively build that solidarity, that's the only way that we're going to be able to do it. And it's not a quick process. And the way we try to do it is we do a lot of outreach. We use the tool of a petition, but we see a petition primarily as an excuse for a conversation that can actually start to walk through some of these ideas with people. And really what I feel like we need is more people who are intentionally trying to have those one-on-one organizing conversations. And, you know, no matter how great we are in TikTok, I don't think that it's a substitute for that real direct human interaction, because we learn ourselves in that process about what are the log jams, and, you know, does raising wages actually cause inflation? Now I had to go find out, you know, so all of these things are a way we learn together. But I think there's no substitute for that very painstaking, labor intensive one-on-one process of building intentional community.
Thank you so much, Pam. That's really helpful. Elizabeth, I will throw it to you, and I'm really sorry that you are feeling upset by some of these things. And I would just encourage, when you are asking your questions, for all of us to try to maintain that sense of respect, even though we might not all agree with what is being said, just so that this can be productive. Please go ahead.
The reason why I'm upset is because of the name calling. There's no need to name call anybody in this, okay? And saying, well, Trump this and Pierre's like Trump. I'm sorry, but that is name calling. I don't appreciate it. I'm a Canadian citizen. I love my country. I believe in closed borders. I believe in protecting the people that are here. I believe in multiculturalism. I believe in making sure that people are not bashed, and that is uncalled for. And I have recorded this. This is unacceptable. We are all humans, and we should not be naming and bashing people and saying things and being fear-mongering. That is unacceptable. Now, I do have a few things to say. Bill, I'm not sure if you're aware, on April 3rd, 2025, there was an article that came out that Carney says law protecting Canada's dairy supply management system is not necessary. Are you aware of that article, Phil?
Not that specific one, no.
I'm sorry. Phil, are you aware of the article that on for Carney saying that Carney says law protecting Canada's dairy supply management is not necessary. This was written on April 3rd, 2025 by the Toronto Star.
Sorry to interrupt, Elizabeth. I think that maybe you're having some issues. He mentioned that he's not aware of that specific article. Do you have a question regarding something that has been said, though?
Yeah, no, because he said it's very important, and I agree that we should be protecting so that we don't have other countries flooding our market. But I mean, that is something that people may or may not be aware of, that Carney doesn't believe in protecting our supply management system.
Okay. Yeah, I appreciate your insight. And of course, we want to remain partisan at FSC. And the goal is not to name call or to make anyone feel angry with the way that we are speaking. What we're trying to do is just have these experts join us and share their perspectives. But the goal is not to make anyone feel.
Name calling is not being adults. We're all supposed to be adults in the room.
I
Or on
understand.
Zoom.
I understand, Elizabeth, and I hear your concern. Again, these are individual peoples with their individual perspectives, and we are sharing their expertise. I am going to move on though, because we do have a lot of other
Okay,
people who are super interested and they want to ask some questions. So I am going to move on. Thank you for joining us.
I'm going to leave this because I don't think that everybody understands what's really at stake here. But everybody should go to the website where it says Future Life Social Mobility in Question. And if you really want a sustainable world, then the best way to do it is to have low emissions, but that is also by us as a country supplying our resources to other countries to bring down the climate issue that everybody seems to be worried about. And honestly, us unleashing our resources is the best way. And as far as housing, everybody should be looking at Carney's plan, because nowhere in Carney's plan does it say that anybody will be allowed to own, and that it is his company that will be building everything.
Okay, thank you so much. Moving along, we have some questions around, could you please touch on potential concerns with food safety for food coming from the US due to funding cuts to key institutions and policy changes? That's interesting.
I can only say that yes, they are cutting those systems. No, those systems didn't work particularly well before either. I'm sure a lot of the people involved are doing their job as best they can. And they've been working for a long time. I mean, it's been a scandal for a long time that a lot of the inspection has been poor. So I don't know what else to say. This is all very new. So obviously there's not evidence yet where we can see what will happen. And everything that does get announced does need to be followed up, because not everything that is announced goes through. But I do know that it's a long-standing, you could look back through many comments on the website of my organization, IATP, to see where we've complained about the poor use of the inspection systems and the oversight of our food safety more broadly. And of course, the way in which this DOGE office has come in and undermined the civil service more generally doesn't bode well for food safety. So that would be my comment. But as in all things, you have to keep looking and reading and understanding what's happening, because it's very difficult to get a single source. But I have read the same thing.
That's a really helpful reminder around like what's being said is not necessarily what's happening. Yeah, Phil, please go ahead.
Yeah, just to add on to that, because I agree, Sophia, there's been a lot of concern for a lot of years over, for example, the sort of regulatory structure in the US, the oversight provided around food and passing new food, for example, or new products as acceptable in the US because it's often then reflected here. Our regulatory structure in Canada has been increasingly saying, yeah, us too, just like them, or they provided the regulatory oversight, so if it's good enough there, then it automatically passes in Canada, when in fact, in many cases, they didn't provide any regulatory oversight because it was understood that it was safe, et cetera, et cetera. So a whole bunch of choices being made. And I think when, if we see that cuts then within the US are going to make that system even more fragile, a Canadian regulator who says if it passes in the US, it's good enough for us, becomes even more problematic than it already was.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, go ahead, Pam.
Just to touch on that, it is also a really important question. Just to say that sometimes when politicians talk about cutting red tape, just like, Sophia's reference to Doge and what Phil's talking about, it really matters that we pause and ask those folks what they're talking about, because cutting red tape when it comes to housing really is about safety standards for the tenants. It's about environmental standards. And it hadn't occurred to me about food testing and food safety, but of course that's, all of that stuff is on the chopping block when it comes to red tape. And much of the red tape exists because people campaign for it and they're protective measures. But there may be some other problems, and I, for one, don't understand why it's so hard to buy a bottle of Nova Scotia wine in Ontario. But I also know that sometimes the safety standards from province to province for transportation workers that have to drive across borders, those are pretty important standards to maintain. So, and if anyone can enlighten me on the wine question, I would love that.
Oh, Pam. Yeah, that is the one actually that we've been facing the most since all of this, particularly since the election campaign started and the interprovincial trade barriers language arose. And, in agriculture in Canada, there are some legitimate interprovincial trade barriers, but they are fairly small, few and far between. And we know at the same time that the same people who use that kind of language are using it with an ideological motivation that's trying to, as you say, hammer down legitimate regulation that's in place to protect people, whether it's within their jurisdiction or what have you. And so, we have been asking that question over and over again when people raise the interprovincial trade barrier is, well, what exactly are you seeing as a barrier? And on the wine, I think that's a holdover from Prohibition. That just hasn't been solved since then.
I have some questions. Is the Nova Scotian wine really, really good? Is that why we're all looking for it? Should I be dabbling a little bit more? We do have another question that came up. Someone had mentioned that they're hearing a lot of information that they've actually heard in other venues before, which is not surprising. But their question is, how do we mainstream these ideas? How can we get these ideas and actions into the political sphere to the point where they are actually discussed or debated? So much of politics has become unhinged from reality. That is so accurate.
Well, I would just say I do think it's a real challenge for organizations like mine, for example, where we're trying to, be part of a public debate, and we're trying also to contribute to civil society coalitions to ensure that they're well informed and that we're learning and also contributing to just being as informed as we can. And the collapse of sort of independent media has been an enormous problem, I think, and so we don't all go to the same source to find out what we believe. And I think that's some of Pat's frustration maybe as well. We're reading different things about what's going on and we understand differently what's presented, although not to call into question what Carney said. I don't know a single Canadian government that I have met that has been wholeheartedly supportive of supply management, even if they say things at different speeches. If you see them in trade negotiations, it's kind of holding their nose while they continue, which is which is a pity. All that said, yeah, I've forgotten my point, I think. Yeah, I've forgotten my point.
That's fine. We can always come back. Phil, Pam, do either of you want to expand on that?
I could take a little try, and if I may be so bold, I'm going to just put a couple of links in the chat. Honestly, I do think it is a challenge, and some of the things that we are discovering is that I think life has just become harder, and the treadmill is so intense for people that it is hard for people to understand the concepts that may or may not have been very current in years gone by. And I feel as though there's, we all of us need to spend a little bit more time on basic economic literacy for people. There's a real, and I think some of it is deliberate through social media and people, but there's a real misconception about how taxes work. And so, for example, some of the debates that we bumped up against when we actually successfully were able to raise the minimum wage, for example, in Ontario, is that instead of minimum wage earners being universally happy about it, which I think I expected that to be the case wrongly, there's a whole bunch of other dynamics at play. And so workers, for example, who spent their whole lives earning very low wages because of our unfair laws, and then finally got a little bit of a raise above the minimum wage so that they're no longer a minimum wage earner, felt really harmed when we got a big bump in the minimum wage, because all of a sudden it's like, what? That 18-year-old kid that's scooping ice cream is going to get the same pay as me after I've been busting my hump for 20 years. That's not fair. And at some level, it's totally fair. Like, her point is completely valid. So some of those things, like having those one-on-one conversations, a little bit. Another thing that we were up against is this notion that's like, well, if our wages go up by 10%, then the price of things are going to go up by 10%, and then we're going to be no better off. Or our wages are going to go up by 10%, our taxes are going to go up by 10%, and then we'll be no better off. And so just that kind of conceptual slippage, and I think it's been cultivated by, some ideological folks. And so I do think those are the things that we start to encounter when we do those one-on-one organizing conversations. And I think there's really great policy conversations that happen at a higher level, but I feel as though oftentimes it's disconnected from ordinary workers who may or may not have the time. And even last thing I'll just say, in the experience we had in Ontario was that when the government that implemented a suite of good legislative changes, what happened to be the Liberal Party, but then that was just the election prior to Conservative Premier Doug Ford getting elected. And Doug Ford had made it clear that he was opposed to raising the minimum wage and was going to cancel. We had a minimum wage bumping from 11 to 14 and then 14 to 15. He campaigned on canceling the minimum wage and cutting taxes. And so what we encountered in the next election was that a lot of people actually thought Doug Ford was the guy that was going to support the good changes that had happened. They didn't know laws could be reversed. They didn't understand about taxes. And so there's just a lot of our people who supported all of our decent work demands still wound up voting for politicians because that says they want to work for workers and that they want to have lots of good jobs and more nurses. And I feel like when people take politicians at face value, that's a good faith gesture. And it makes me sad that we sometimes have to unpack what those words mean. But we can't figure out where people are at and what information people need unless we're having those one-on-one conversations. And honestly, I feel like we need an army of patient persuaders who are prepared to have the conversations with coworkers and neighbors and family and have those difficult and ask people why. Why are you supporting this politician over that politician? Why are you supporting this cause over that cause? Because we might learn a lot in the process and discover we have a lot more in common. And last thing I'll just say quickly is that there's some opinion polls in Canada that shows a real disconnect between values and voting. And I think that it's just the case that people don't have the same attachment to political parties maybe as they had in the past, but the common denominators exist. Everybody wants better wages. A lot of people, regardless how they vote, want corporations to be taxed properly. So it turns out these are not partisan issues per se, although they get expressed in a partisan way during an election. But if we can actually unite people around what they themselves want and dream for, I think we can make a lot of headway.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Oh, please, Phil, go ahead.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more to all of that, Pam. One thing I wanted to say is that I think in 2025 that perhaps, by the way, the NFU is a completely nonpartisan organization. We make a point of sticking to that in all public pronouncements and in all of our policy. It may be the case in 2025 that there are more folks who are disenchanted with the system, the electoral system that we have, as opposed to, you know, any partisan issues that they may or may not have. Oh, and I forgot Sophia is catching. I forgot the point that I initially wanted to make while making that point. I'm sorry about that, folks.
No, don't be sorry. Again, if it comes back to either of you, we'll loop back. Yeah, no, I appreciate what all of you have been saying. I really appreciate what you're saying, Pam, around, you know, these topics are not as divisive as I think we think they are. Again, they come out in partisan ways, but the reality is a lot of us are looking for the same thing. We're looking for equity and equality, and we're looking for fairness for the majority of people. And I think that unfortunately it has become so political, and it does really rely a lot on us not fully understanding what is happening. Phil, are you remembering? Yes, please go ahead.
Indeed, yes. The other piece was that one thing that we're finding, it being 2025 and all, is that our farmer and farm worker members are actually completely linked. So they aren't just farmers and farm workers. They have other lives. They have other communities that they're a part of, other interests that, you know, that resonate for them. And so they are actually our connection to other civil society organizations and other interest movements. And so it's just finding a way of sort of integrating that, because as you can imagine, being farmers and farm workers, as well as keenly involved people, there aren't a lot of spare hours in the day, but certainly we try, you know, at every turn to make connections between folks, either that, you know, we as an organization or we as individuals are connected to, and draw the lines, the points of commonality that we can sort of build upon and build relationships with.
Appreciate that. And at the risk of preaching to folks who might already know this, I think this is also the model of Food Secure Canada, right? We're trying to implement and influence that policy change at that federal level, but based on the feedback and the information that we hear from workers and individuals and folks all across the sector, so that not every single person needs to be an expert in policy and in politics, but all they need to do is share what it is that they're looking for, and that helps inform those discussions. Okay, we have 5 minutes left, and so what I'm going to do is just give you each a minute or two to wrap up anything you want to make sure is said before we go, and super appreciate all the time and appreciate everybody's questions. So I'm going to start with Sophia, and we'll go around my screen.
So I put in the chat the thought that I was starting with, which is on how to mainstream it. And I do think COVID opened a lot of possibilities, and it's still very recent memory for people. And we also experimented both in the US, but also in Canada with some things. And Pam touched on that again in her first remarks about what it means to have something more like a minimum wage that is livable. And there were tax reforms in the US I could point to. I don't know about Canada, like child dependent taxes and so on, that made an enormous difference to very poor households immediately, just simply by not having to pay all the tax and wait for a refund once a year, but getting that, not paying too much to start with, because when you live month to month, you're not waiting for that. So the other thing Yeah, I think that we should be kind of thinking about what the just transition is that we think we want to see, and then working back from there, and then recognizing there's this moment, and I think part of that just transition is for kind of rural society writ large is another conversation going on here, where a lot of times agriculture and farming in particular is ignored because it's not seen as it's just not a big part of the formally counted economy. And so the connections we make to consumers are important, but I think there are connections we neglect to broader rural society. And Canada, as in the US, has become very polarized politically. And one of the fault lines is rural and urban life. And that's because rural life is very poorly served by a highly concentrated oligopolistic distribution system. And the resilience that you would have from distributing that is something rural life attests to, that is what it exemplifies. And the renewal that has gone on through new communities coming into rural worlds has also been something that we were trying to make much of, and that has been stopped by the current government in the United States, but is something that I think we could celebrate and understand. The whole conversation for us has been framed around emerging farmers, but I think those conversations just are very important, and I think could be bridge building, because they don't fall into some of the so-called culture war divisions that have been so have plagued us so much.
Thanks so much, Sophia. Pam, any last words?
Well, maybe just to build on the point about the bottom-up approach, and I like the analogy of lightning goes from the bottom up, but and one of the analogies we sometimes use in our movement is just that water boils when individual molecules vibrate. And if we can get other little molecules vibrating, then, that's really how water starts to boil. So even though it may feel like we're small and our networks are limited, those vibrating molecules are absolutely essential. Without that, water will never boil. And I do want to touch on the whole question of electoral efficiency, because in Ontario, when we've had different governments, I feel like a lot of ordinary working class people don't feel like their life changes all that much depending on who gets elected. And I think if we look historically at what has affected the most change, it really is when we take action together. And I feel like some of that history gets lost. And if we can help to remind people, like, people love healthcare in Canada, it could be better and should be better and more universal. But still, like, we got that because we fought for it. That I'm assuming that the supply management agreement for farmers probably came because people fought for it, I'm assuming, and so how do we recreate those traditions so that we're not just waiting for the one person, the one savior to come along and get the right policy, get the right words in the right order and everything's going to be fine? Because I think when we are up against some global systems, it really is going to take all of us being prepared to push back. And last thing I'll just say, I have loved this conversation, that I really appreciate. I'm so honored to be part of this panel, and I'm really happy to know Sophia and Phil, and I hope we can stay in touch with all of you after this. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Phil, closing comments?
I will agree wholeheartedly. It's been an incredibly rich conversation. Thanks to everyone on the panel. And the one piece I would add is I think we've had our best successes when we find not just points of commonality, but a common goal or agenda that many different people would support. They just need to find their way in. And so in part of what we do is try to draw the connections or draw the lines, the ways of seeing how either they're being ill served by an existing system or, this thing that we're trying to protect. So for example, protecting farmland around urban centers is a huge thing in Ontario, but in many provinces around many major cities, because they tend to be formed around like really good land. Um, and we always find, but there's many different ways that people come into that conversation, right? Whether they like the landscape that they imagine from their childhood, the rural landscape, or they're, in favor of protecting ecological systems, or they're trying to ensure that maybe their children or grandchildren might be able to either grow food or have food grown for them fresh right there on, within driving distance. Like there's many ways into that conversation, but we found some of our biggest support around initiatives to save land from unnecessary urban development, whether that be another major highway ringing another major city or whether it's, developing land way far away from an urban center when there's land right inside the urban center that still needs development. Anyway, it's just bringing people together through different sort of prisms of the same conversation, which has happened a lot today, actually.
It absolutely has. Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody. And this chat has been so rich as well. So anyone who has the capacity to read through it, I suggest that. I think to wrap it all up, what I'm hearing is we're stronger together. We're clearly all very, very passionate people. And if we can all act as the individual bubbles, then change will happen. And Nova Scotian wine is apparently the best, and we should all be investing. So there we go. Lessons learned. Thank you everybody so much for joining. And we'll talk to you all soon. This recording will be up and we will make sure to have it translated into French as well. Sorry for those who couldn't participate live because of our translation issues. But keep an eye on Food Secure Canada. Make sure you get out and vote. We have our Eat, Think, Vote events happening still all the way up until Election Day. And so take a look at the Eat, Think, Vote website, which is thrown into the chat there. Thank you, Andy, in French and in English for an event that might be close to you, that might help you go and have these conversations on the ground level with people that care as well. So thanks, everybody. Bye now.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. Bye-bye.